In the late autumn of 1941, deep within the vast, featureless wasteland of the Libyan desert, a lone military command vehicle sat swallowed by dusk. Outside, the wind howled across hundreds of miles of empty sand and gravel, sweeping away the smoke of burning tanks and the fading echoes of artillery fire. Inside the cramped trailer, illuminated only by a harsh, swaying overhead lamp, two men stood staring down at a table littered with topographical maps and intelligence reports. One was General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief of British Middle East Command. He was a towering, resolute figure who possessed an unshakable belief that the war against fascist Europe could only be won through ruthless, unrelenting aggression. The other was Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, the commander of the newly formed British Eighth Army. Cunningham was a man whose military reputation had skyrocketed just months earlier, celebrated as a brilliant practitioner of fast-moving mobile warfare. But tonight, Cunningham looked broken. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt, and his fingers trembled slightly as he pointed to the devastating casualty figures from the front lines. Over 4 days of catastrophic tank battles, the British armour had been systematically torn to pieces by General Erwin Rommel's formidable Afrika Korps. Cunningham looked up at his commander and spoke an unthinkable truth. The offensive had failed. The Allied armour was spent. If they did not retreat immediately across the border to reorganize and protect the Nile Delta, the Eighth Army would be encircled and destroyed, leaving Egypt and the Suez Canal completely defenseless. Auchinleck listened in cold, heavy silence. He did not deny the terrifying numbers on the table. He knew the losses were appalling. But Auchinleck saw something that his field commander could no longer perceive through the fog of battle. He saw that Rommel was also bleeding to death. He saw that the enemy was on the verge of exhaustion, hanging on by a thread. To retreat now would be to hand Hitler a victory at the precise moment when perseverance could deliver a decisive triumph. What happened next in that wind-battered tent would send shockwaves through the entire British military establishment. In the middle of the largest, most chaotic armoured battle the world had ever seen, Auchinleck made a desperate and brutal decision. He relieved Alan Cunningham of his command on the spot. It was an action virtually unprecedented in modern British military history. To sack a top army commander in the very heat of battle was a move fraught with immense political and operational risk. In the days that followed, the official record would weave a soft, polite fiction, claiming that Cunningham was suffering from severe physical exhaustion and battle fatigue. But those present in the war room knew the stark, brutal reality. Alan Cunningham was not relieved because he was tired. He was sacked because he had dared to tell his superiors an unvarnished truth they refused to accept. He had looked into the abyss of the Western Desert, calculated the cold arithmetic of modern industrial slaughter, and concluded that victory was impossible. To understand how a highly decorated British general went from being hailed as the saviour of East Africa to being stripped of his army in a desert trailer, one must look back to the desperate summer of 1941, when the fate of the entire Allied cause hung by a thread in the sands of North Africa. By mid-1941, the Second World War had reached a dark, agonizing stalemate. Western Europe lay entirely under the iron heel of Nazi Germany. Great Britain stood alone in Europe, enduring the Blitz and fighting a desperate war for survival in the Atlantic. But thousands of miles to the south, the desolate, sun-scorched coastline of North Africa had transformed into the primary battleground between the British Empire and the Axis powers. The strategic stakes in North Africa were unimaginably high. Whoever controlled the narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sahara Desert held the key to the entire Middle East. If the Axis forces could push east across Egypt, they would capture the Suez Canal, severing Britain's primary maritime lifeline to India, Australia, and its vast imperial empire. Even worse, a victory in Egypt would open the gateway to the rich oil fields of Iraq and Persia, providing Nazi Germany with the fuel it desperately needed to power its war machine. Initially, the Desert War had seemed like an easy victory for the British. When fascist Italy entered the war, its massive forces in Libya attempted to invade Egypt. But in late 1940, a small, highly aggressive British force under General Richard O'Connor launched Operation Compass. In one of the most astonishing campaigns in military history, O'Connor's men routed the Italian army, advancing over 500 miles, taking over 100,000 prisoners, and completely shattering Italian power in North Africa. Alarmed by the total collapse of his Italian ally, Adolf Hitler stepped in. He dispatched a small but elite German force to Tripoli, the Afrika Korps. To command this force, Hitler chose a bold, highly energetic armored warfare specialist who had already made a name for himself during the invasion of France. His name was Erwin Rommel. Rommel's arrival instantly transformed the North African theatre. Ignoring cautious orders from Berlin to maintain a defensive posture, Rommel analyzed the stretched, overextended British positions and struck with speed and savagery. Utilizing superior mobility, aggressive reconnaissance, and the devastating tactical coordination of his panzer divisions, Rommel drove the British all the way back across Cyrenaica to the Egyptian border. Only one strategic point held out behind Rommel's advancing lines: the fortress port of Tobruk. Tucked against the Mediterranean coast, Tobruk was defended by a tenacious garrison composed primarily of Australian, British, and Indian troops. Rommel recognized that he could not launch a full-scale invasion of Egypt while Tobruk remained in enemy hands, sitting directly astride his fragile supply lines. He launched assault after assault against the fortress, but the defenders fought off every attack, earning themselves the proud nickname, the Rats of Tobruk. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill grew increasingly frantic. Churchill was obsessed with the Western Desert. He viewed it as the only theatre where British land forces could directly engage and defeat German troops on open ground, proving to the world and to the United States that Britain was still capable of winning the war. Churchill began raining down aggressive telegrams upon his commander in Cairo, General Sir Archibald Wavell, demanding immediate, large-scale offensives to relieve Tobruk and drive Rommel out of Africa. Wavell launched two hasty offensives, Operation Brevity and Operation Battle Axe, designed to break through Rommel's border defenses and link up with Tobruk. Both operations were unmitigated disasters. British tank tactics were crude and uncoordinated, and they ran headlong into Rommel's lethal anti-tank ambushes, featuring the legendary 88mm anti-aircraft guns deployed in a direct-fire ground roll. Dozens of British tanks were left burning in the desert, without ever seeing the German armor they were searching for. Losing patience with what he perceived as excessive caution, Churchill removed Wavell from command in July 1941. To replace him, Churchill selected General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck arrived in Cairo with a formidable reputation. Tall, stern, and deeply respected by his officers, Auchinleck was a veteran of the Indian Army who possessed an uncompromising sense of duty. But if Churchill believed he had found a malleable general who would blindly launch an immediate attack, he was severely mistaken. Auchinleck refused to be rushed. He informed Churchill in clear, unyielding terms that he would not launch a new offensive until his forces were thoroughly trained, fully equipped, and numerical superiority in tanks and aircraft was absolute. For months, a tense, angry battle of wills played out in secret telegrams between London and Cairo. Churchill fumed, demanding an immediate strike, while Auchinleck stood his ground, building up a massive striking force in the Egyptian desert. This force would be organized into an entirely new army, the British 8th Army. Now, Auchinleck needed a field commander to lead this new army into battle. He needed someone who possessed energy, drive, and a track record of victorious mobile warfare. His eyes turned toward the East African theater, where a 54-year-old artillery officer had just accomplished what many had thought impossible. That officer was Major General Alan Cunningham. Alan Cunningham was a soft-spoken, highly meticulous soldier with a distinguished career. In early 1941, he had been tasked with leading British and Commonwealth forces in East Africa against the Italian Empire in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and Somalia. Operating across vast distances of rugged mountains, dense jungles, and waterless deserts, Cunningham executed a brilliant, lightning-fast campaign. In just 3 months, his forces covered over 1,700 miles, smashed an Italian army vastly superior in numbers, and liberated the country, taking over 17,000 prisoners with remarkably light casualties. Cunningham's victory in Abyssinia made him an instant national hero in Britain. He was knighted, promoted to lieutenant general, and lauded as a master of fast, mobile operations. When Auchinleck searched for a dynamic field commander to lead the 8th Army, Cunningham seemed like the ideal candidate. He was a commander who understood speed, logistics, and the psychological impact of aggressive movement. In September 1941, Cunningham took command of the 8th Army. But beneath the surface of his stellar reputation, a quiet, dangerous mismatch was taking shape. The warfare Cunningham had mastered in East Africa was fundamentally different from the war he was about to face in the Western Desert. In Abyssinia, Cunningham had fought a poorly motivated, demoralized Italian enemy across difficult terrain where maneuver could easily turn a flank and force a surrender. But in the Western Desert, there were no mountain passes or strategic choke points. The desert was a vast, featureless ocean of sand, stone, and scrub, where land warfare closely resembled naval engagements. More importantly, the enemy in North Africa was not a broken Italian garrison. It was Erwin Rommel and his veteran panzer divisions, backed by a sophisticated doctrine of combined arms warfare that integrated tanks, mobile infantry, motorized artillery, and devastating anti-tank weapons into a single, highly flexible combat system. As Cunningham sat in his headquarters in Egypt, studying the operational plans for the upcoming offensive, codenamed Operation Crusader, he began to feel a profound sense of foreboding. The strategic objectives of Operation Crusader were immense. Cunningham was ordered to cross the Egyptian border, destroy Rommel's armored forces in a decisive battle of annihilation, relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk, and drive the Axis forces out of Cyrenaica entirely. On paper, Cunningham held a massive numerical advantage. The 8th Army assembled over 730 operational tanks, backed by another 500 in reserve or transit. Rommel, by contrast, could muster only about 414 tanks, of which only 249 were German panzers, the remainder being lighter, vastly inferior Italian tanks. The Allied air forces also held clear air superiority over the battlefield. To execute this grand vision, Cunningham divided his army into 2 primary striking forces. The heavy lifting would be done by 30th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Willoughby Norrie. This corps contained the elite 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, equipped with heavy Matilda infantry tanks, British cruiser tanks, and newly arrived American-made M3 Stuart light tanks, which the British troops affectionately dubbed Honeys. 33rd Corps was ordered to sweep wide around the enemy's southern desert flank, seek out Rommel's panzers, and force them into a decisive, open battle of destruction. Meanwhile, the 13th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Reed Godwin Austin, composed primarily of infantry divisions from New Zealand, India, and South Africa, would pin down the Axis border defences before advancing northwest toward Tobruk to join hands with a breakout force from the besieged fortress. It was a bold, ambitious plan, but it contained a critical, fundamental flaw. Cunningham and his senior planners assumed that because they possessed more tanks, they could simply seek out the German armour and destroy it in a chivalric set-piece duel. They failed to realize that the German military did not view armor as an isolated weapon. Rommel did not fight tank versus tank battles if he could avoid it. He used his tanks to lure enemy armor into carefully prepared screens of anti-tank guns, where the British armor would be systematically destroyed at long range. Furthermore, British tank design and doctrine in 1941 were dangerously obsolete. Most British tanks were equipped with the 2-pounder gun, which lacked an explosive high fragmentation shell, meaning British tank crews could not engage German anti-tank gun crews at a distance. To destroy an anti-tank position, British tanks had to charge directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. Meanwhile, the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were equipped with longer, more powerful guns, and their tactical communication via shortwave radios was infinitely superior to the erratic radio networks of the British divisions. As the launch date for the offensive approached, Cunningham's internal doubts deepened. He raised questions about the strength of Rommel's forces and the reliability of his own supply lines. But Churchill's political clock was ticking loudly in London, and Auchinleck was adamant. The Eighth Army would strike, and it would strike with maximum force. On the night of November 17th, 1941, Nature threw a dramatic prelude over the battlefield. A rare, violent, torrential rainstorm erupted across the desert. Thunder roared. Lightning illuminated the vast expanse of sand, and flash floods turned the dry wadis into raging torrents of mud. The storm wiped out German air reconnaissance and disrupted communications, granting the British complete tactical surprise. At dawn on November 18th, Operation Crusader began. Over 100,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks, armored cars, and heavy artillery, surged across the wire. The rusted iron frontier fence separating British-held Egypt from Italian-controlled Libya. It was a staggering sight. Long columns of vehicles kicked up massive clouds of dust that stretched for miles across the desert floor. Initially, everything went extraordinarily well. 1010 Corps swept through the southern flank against almost no resistance. The British armour advanced nearly 50 miles into enemy territory without encountering major opposition. Cunningham's tactical surprise was so complete that Rommel, who was suffering from a severe stomach illness and had just returned from a trip to Rome, initially refused to believe that a major British offensive had begun, dismissing the sightings as a mere reconnaissance in force. Encouraged by the smooth advance, Cunningham and his corps commanders made a fateful error. Instead of keeping his massive armoured force concentrated as a single unstoppable fist, Willoughby Norrie began dispersing his divisions to cover multiple objectives. One armoured brigade was sent toward the frontier fortifications, another was ordered to move north toward Tobruk, and a third was held in reserve. By spreading his tanks across a 40-mile radius, Cunningham surrendered his numerical superiority. He had divided his strength into isolated fragments, allowing Rommel to deal with them one by one. On November 19th, Rommel realized the true scale of the British offensive and snapped into action. Recovering from his initial surprise with breathtaking speed, the Desert Fox ordered his two elite Panzer divisions, the 15th and 21st Panzer divisions, to concentrate and strike the scattered British armoured columns. The clash occurred around a desolate, windswept ridge known as Sidi Rezegh. Sidi Rezegh was a location of supreme tactical importance. It featured a small desert airfield sitting atop an escarpment just 20 miles south of the Tobruk perimeter. If the British could capture and hold Sidi Rezegh, they could link up with the garrison breaking out from Tobruk, cutting Rommel's forces in two. For 4 agonizing days, from November 19th to November 22nd, Sidi Rezegh became the scene of some of the most violent, confused, and bloody combat of the entire North African War. The battlefield was a horrifying vision of hell. The air was thick with blinding dust, churning sand, and the black, greasy smoke of hundreds of burning vehicles. Shells whistled through the haze from every direction. Tactical control shattered almost immediately. Regiments became separated from their brigades. Individual tanks fought solitary duels against unseen anti-tank positions through the fog of war. The noise was deafening. The mechanical roar of engines, the sharp crack of tank guns, and the agonizing screams of men burning alive inside twisted steel hulls. The British tank crews fought with incredible, desperate bravery. In brigade after brigade, young officers led daring charges against the German lines, driving their light Stuart and cruiser tanks directly into the fire of entrenched German anti-tank batteries. But courage alone could not overcome the stark reality of tactical superiority. Rommel's anti-tank gunners, operating the lethal 88mm guns, picked off the British tanks with terrifying precision before the British vehicles could even get close enough to range their 2-pounder guns. When British tanks managed to breach the German lines, the German panzers would counterattack from the flanks, trapping the British in lethal crossfires. At 8th Army headquarters, far behind the front lines, Alan Cunningham watched the situation map with mounting horror. Every hour, urgent, frantic radio messages poured into the command tent. The reports were catastrophic. The 7th Armoured Brigade had been virtually wiped out, reduced from over 500 tanks to a mere handful of operational vehicles. The 22nd Armoured Brigade had suffered devastating losses against Italian armoured divisions and German anti-tank screens. The battlefield around Sidi Rezegh was described as a massive graveyard of scorched British armour. Cunningham's strategic vision began to fracture under the immense weight of these reports. In his mind, he was no longer directing a triumphant offensive. He was witnessing the systematic annihilation of his army's striking arm. Cunningham was an artillery officer by training, a man used to calculated, logical balance sheets of force, ammunition, and firepower. He looked at the rapidly dwindling numbers of operational British tanks and performed a simple, cold, mathematical calculation. If the 8th Army continued to lose tanks at this horrific rate, within 48 hours they would have no armour left at all. Once the armour was gone, Rommel's victorious panzers would sweep around his helpless infantry divisions, cut off their supply lines, and slaughter them at will. What Cunningham failed to see, and what his isolation in headquarters prevented him from understanding, was the state of the enemy. Across the smoke-choked ridge at Sidi Rezegh, Erwin Rommel was experiencing his own private nightmare. The Afrika Korps was bleeding to death. German tank losses were almost as high as the British, and unlike the 8th Army, which had massive reserves sitting back in Egypt, Rommel had no replacements coming. His supply ships were routinely being sunk in the Mediterranean by British submarines and aircraft based in Malta. German ammunition was running dangerously low, fuel tanks were dry, and his men were physically exhausted after days of continuous combat. Rommel was fighting on pure adrenaline and willpower, maintaining a fierce, aggressive posture to mask the fact that his forces were on the absolute brink of collapse. But Cunningham could not see Rommel's empty fuel trucks or his depleted ammunition boxes. He saw only the mountain of steel destroyed on his own side. On November 23rd, a day that would become known in German military history as Totensonntag, the Sunday of the Dead, the crisis reached a fever pitch. Rommel launched a massive, concentrated armoured charge aimed at smashing the remnants of the British armour and the 1st South African Division at Sidi Rezegh. The assault was a brutal, bloody success. The South African Brigade was overrun, losing thousands of men, and the British armoured divisions were scattered into complete disarray. To Cunningham, Totensonntag was the final straw. His nerve snapped. He firmly believed that the 8th Army had reached a point of catastrophic failure. The relief of Tobruk was now impossible. To remain in Libya was to court total disaster. Cunningham concluded that the only responsible, rational military decision was to break off Operation Crusader immediately, order a general retreat, and withdraw the entire 8th Army 50 miles back to the safety of the fortified positions at Mersa Matruh, inside the Egyptian border. On the evening of November 23rd, Cunningham dispatched an urgent, high-priority telegram to Cairo. He requested that General Sir Claude Auchinleck come immediately to his battle headquarters at Fort Madalena, located near the Libyan border. The telegram was worded with grave urgency. Cunningham made it clear that he needed his commander-in-chief's personal presence to authorize a critical strategic decision: the total suspension of the offensive and an immediate retreat to Egypt. When the telegram reached Middle East Command headquarters in Cairo, Auchinleck recognized the immense danger. He did not hesitate. Accompanied by his Deputy Chief of General Staff, Major General Neil Ritchie, and a senior air officer, Auchinleck boarded his personal aircraft and flew straight into the desert, arriving at Cunningham's battle headquarters late that night. The meeting that took place inside Cunningham's headquarters tent on the night of November 23rd is one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations in the history of the British military. Outside, the cold desert wind battered the canvas walls of the tent. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Cunningham, pale, visibly shaken and physically exhausted, laid out the catastrophic situation to his chief. He presented the latest intelligence reports, showing that British tank strength had been reduced from over 700 to fewer than 150 operational vehicles. He argued passionately that if they pushed forward, the 8th Army's armor would be totally wiped out, leaving Egypt completely open to a German invasion. "If we continue," Cunningham warned, "we risk losing the entire army." Auchinleck listened intently, his face carved from granite. He asked pointed, incisive questions about the state of the infantry, the air support, and the reserves back in Egypt. He acknowledged the terrible losses his army had suffered, but then Auchinleck looked his field commander dead in the eye and delivered a stunning, uncompromising response. "Allen," Auchinleck said firmly, "your decision is wrong. You must continue to attack." Cunningham was stunned. He tried to protest, pointing back to the terrifying casualty charts on the table. But Auchinleck was operating on a completely different level of strategic thinking. Auchinleck recognized that Operation Crusader had reached the classic turning point of any great battle. The moment where both sides are so utterly exhausted, battered and demoralized that victory belongs entirely to the commander who possesses the superior will to endure. Auchinleck understood that Rommel was at his absolute limit. If the British retreated now, they would allow Rommel to recover, regroup, and claim a miraculous victory. But if the 8th Army continued to strike, even with broken, bleeding knuckles, Rommel would eventually collapse. Auchinleck picked up a pen and drafted an official written order directly to Cunningham. The directive was unambiguous. "You will continue to attack the enemy with every scrap of force at your disposal. The objective remains the destruction of the enemy's armed forces and the relief of Tobruk. There will be no retreat." Cunningham accepted the written order like a disciplined soldier, but his conviction was gone. He was a commander, being forced to execute an operation he believed, in his heart of hearts, was an invitation to slaughter. The next day, November 24th, Erwin Rommel executed one of the most famous, controversial, and terrifying maneuvers of his military career: the dash to the wire. Frustrated by the stubborn resistance at Sidi Rezeg, and unaware that Cunningham had been on the verge of ordering a retreat, Rommel decided to play his highest card gamble. He gathered his surviving panzer divisions and personally led them on a high-speed strike eastward, smashing straight through the British rear areas toward the Egyptian border. Rommel's objective was purely psychological. He intended to sever the 8th Army supply lines, attack their command headquarters, and trigger a widespread, panicked retreat back into Egypt. For 24 hours, Rommel's dash to the wire caused utter, unimaginable chaos behind the British lines. Column after column of German tanks surged through the desert, tearing through supply depots, medical units, and administrative bases. British soft-skinned vehicles fled eastward in clouds of dust. Senior British officers were nearly captured. 8th Army headquarters itself came dangerously close to being overrun. Inside the command post at Fort Madeleine, the panic was palpable. Reports flashed in from every direction that German panzers were sweeping across the border wire, operating deep inside Egypt and threatening to trap the entire 8th Army in a massive pocket. To Alan Cunningham, The dash to the wire was the final confirmation of his worst fears. The catastrophic encirclement he had predicted was happening right before his eyes. He urged immediate action to secure the border and protect the army's rear. But Claude Auchinleck, who had remained at Cunningham's headquarters to oversee the operation, showed a towering, almost inhuman calm. While others around him panicked, Auchinleck saw Rommel's move for what it truly was: a desperate, wildly overextended gamble by a man who was running out of options. Auchinleck realized that by driving his panzers 50 miles to the east, Rommel had disconnected himself from his own supply bases and left his infantry and anti-tank forces at Tobruk completely unprotected. Rommel was running out of fuel in the middle of the desert, isolated from his command structure. Instead of ordering a retreat, Auchinleck ordered the British forces at Tobruk and Sidi Rezeh to stand firm and continue pressing the assault. He directed mobile British columns to harass Rommel's supply trucks and fuel convoys, turning the desert behind the German panzers into a lethal killing ground. As the hours passed, Auchinleck watched Cunningham closely. It became painfully obvious that Cunningham had lost his grasp on the battle. He was no longer commanding. He was reacting in terror to every wild rumor that swept through the headquarters. His confidence was shattered. His moral authority burned out. Auchinleck faced an agonizing moral and operational dilemma. Cunningham was a personal friend, a highly respected general, and a hero of the Empire. To strip him of his command in the middle of a fluid, desperate battle was an incredible risk that could shatter the morale of the Eighth Army and trigger a massive political backlash in London. But Auchinleck knew that a commander who no longer believes in victory cannot win a battle. In modern, high-intensity warfare, a general's crisis of faith is far more dangerous than the loss of an armoured brigade. On the morning of November 25th, Auchinleck made his decision. He pulled Cunningham aside into a private room. In a quiet, heavy voice, Auchinleck informed Cunningham that he was relieving him of his command of the Eighth Army. Cunningham received the news in silence. There were no dramatic arguments, no bitter outbursts. He simply bowed his head, packed his personal belongings, and prepared to leave the desert theatre. To replace him, Auchinleck needed someone immediately. He chose his Deputy Chief of General Staff, 38-year-old Major General Neil Ritchie. Ritchie was a young, highly intelligent and competent staff officer, but he lacked any experience commanding large forces in the field. Auchinleck knew this, which is why he took an extraordinary step. Auchinleck decided to remain at 8th Army headquarters himself for the next 10 days, effectively acting as the true field commander, while using Ritchie as his operational executive officer. Meanwhile, a massive cover story was quickly constructed to explain Cunningham's sudden removal to the public and the troops. An official medical bulletin was released, stating that General Alan Cunningham had suffered a severe physical breakdown due to extreme exhaustion and battle fatigue, requiring him to be immediately evacuated to a hospital in Alexandria for rest and recuperation. While the polite fiction of medical exhaustion was radioed back to London, the brutal battle in the desert reached its violent climax. Auchinleck's bold calculation proved spectacularly correct. By November 26th, Rommel's dash to the wire had completely ground to a halt. Stranded in the empty desert without fuel, his panzers were sitting ducks for British artillery and RAF fighter bombers. Realizing that his gamble had failed and that his troops at Tobruk were in mortal danger, Rommel was forced to order a painful, humiliating retreat back to Sidi Rezeh. When the Afrika Korps arrived back at the main battlefield, they found a British army that refused to break. Under Auchinleck's unrelenting leadership, the 8th Army had held its ground and launched new aggressive attacks. On the night of November 26th, the 2nd New Zealand Division fought a terrifying bayonet-to-bayonet battle in the dark, capturing the high ground at Ed Duda. Hours later, the garrison from Tobruk breached the Axis siege lines and linked up with the New Zealanders. For the first time in 242 days, the siege of Tobruk was broken. Rommel threw his remaining panzers into a series of furious, desperate counterattacks over the next week. but the British lines held fast. The cost was breathtaking. Thousands of men lay dead in the sand, and hundreds of burned-out tanks littered the desert floor. But the Axis forces had nothing left to give. On December 7th, 1941, the exact same day that Japanese bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor halfway across the world, Erwin Rommel conceded defeat. He ordered a general retreat, abandoning all his hard-won territory in Cyrenaica and pulling the Africa Corps all the way back to El Agheila, near the Tripolitanian border. Operation Crusader was over. It was the first time in the entire Second World War that a German field marshal had been decisively defeated on the battlefield and forced into a major strategic retreat. The victory sent a wave of relief and triumph through Great Britain and its allies. Back in Britain, the press celebrated the liberation of Tobruk and the defeat of the legendary Desert Fox. But behind closed doors, in the corridors of the War Office and Parliament, the quiet, tragic tragedy of Alan Cunningham lingered like a dark shadow. After being evacuated to Alexandria, Cunningham was examined by military doctors who confirmed what everyone secretly knew. He was not suffering from any neurological breakdown or physical disease. He was simply a capable, highly logical general who had encountered an operational scenario that defied standard tactical logic, lost his nerve under intense pressure, and told his superiors a truth they did not want to hear. Cunningham returned to Britain in early 1942. For months he lived in an agonizing military limbo, his brilliant victory in Abyssinia forever overshadowed by his humiliating dismissal in the Western Desert. The British military establishment, recognizing his administrative talent and personal integrity, eventually restored his career. He held senior training commands in Britain and went on to serve as the Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Northern Ireland. After the war, Cunningham was appointed High Commissioner for Palestine, presiding over the complex, violent end of the British Mandate during one of the most perilous geopolitical crises of the 20th century. He served with distinction, quiet dignity, and unwavering professionalism until his retirement, carrying the silent burden of November 1941 to his grave in 1983. The tragic irony of Alan Cunningham's story lies in the dark, brutal twist of history that followed his departure from the Western Desert. When Cunningham warned Auchinleck in that wind-swept tent that the Eighth Army's tactical doctrine was broken, that its tanks were inferior, and that Rommel would eventually find a way to destroy them if those fundamental flaws were not fixed, he was speaking a profound, prophetic truth. 6 months after Operation Crusader, in May 1942, Erwin Rommel struck back. At the Battle of Gazala, Rommel maneuvered around the Eighth Army's flank and unleashed a tactical masterpiece, exploiting the exact same British tactical deficiencies that Cunningham had raised during Crusader. Neil Ritchie, the man who had replaced Cunningham, lost control of the battle. The Eighth Army was shattered, losing over 500 tanks in a matter of days. Tobruk, the fortress that had stood firm for nearly a year, surrendered to Rommel in a humiliating collapse, yielding over 30,000 prisoners. In the wake of the Gazala disaster, Claude Auchinleck was forced to step in once again, personally relieving Neil Ritchie of his command and taking direct control of the Eighth Army to save Egypt at the First Battle of El Alamein. But the political fallout was unstoppable. Churchill, furious over the loss of Tobruk, removed Auchinleck from his command in August 1942, replacing him with General Sir Bernard Montgomery. It was Montgomery who would ultimately receive the everlasting glory for defeating Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein, utilizing vast numerical superiority, massive industrial production, and American Sherman tanks to finally crush the Africa Corps. But Montgomery's victorious campaign was built upon the bloody, hard-learned lessons that were bought with the lives of Cunningham's men during the chaotic winter of 1941. The story of General Alan Cunningham remains one of the most compelling and haunting human dramas in the history of modern warfare. It is a story that exposes the brutal, unyielding nature of high command, where the line between courageous persistence and suicidal madness is paper-thin. Cunningham was not a coward, nor was he an incompetent officer. He was a brilliant, conscientious general who looked at the cold, terrifying facts of the battlefield and saw a reality that logic dictated was unwinnable. But in the violent crucible of high-stakes military strategy, logic is sometimes the enemy of victory. Claude Auchinleck understood what Cunningham could not: that war is ultimately a contest of human wills, a brutal theater, where the leader who refuses to accept defeat can sometimes force reality to bend to his resolve. Alan Cunningham paid the ultimate professional price for speaking his truth. Sacked in the middle of a desert battle, his story stands as a timeless testament to the devastating pressures borne by those who command in the dark fog of war, where telling the unvarnished truth can cost a general his army, his reputation, and his legacy, while changing the course of history forever.